February the 8th, 1944. The frozen skies above occupied Europe hung heavy with the droning menace of German fighters, and America's bomber crews were dying at a rate that made even hardened commanders pale. Major General James Harold "Jimmy" Doolittle stood at the window of his headquarters at Bushy Park, England, watching another formation of battered B-17 bombers limp home, their aluminum fuselages punctured like colanders. Half of them wouldn't make it back. He knew this because he'd seen the same grim arithmetic play out for months. The 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging men and machines faster than factories could replace them. Bomber crews had coined a darkly fatalistic term for their predicament. They called themselves dead men on leave. Every mission into the Reich's heartland meant running a gauntlet of Messerschmitt fighters and Focke-Wulf interceptors that savaged the lumbering bombers with impunity. The flying fortresses and liberators could hit their targets, but the price was becoming unbearable. Some raids saw casualty rates exceeding 25%. Young men barely old enough to vote were being incinerated in aluminum coffins at 25,000 feet. Doolittle had inherited this nightmare just weeks earlier, in January 1944, when he took command of the 8th Air Force from Lieutenant General Ira Eaker. The Tokyo raid hero carried a reputation that preceded him like thunder. The man who'd bombed Japan in 1942 when America desperately needed a victory, launching B-25 bombers from an aircraft carrier in a mission that defied every conventional wisdom. But bombing Tokyo and fixing the 8th Air Force were entirely different propositions. The conventional doctrine seemed unassailable. Fighter escorts existed solely to protect bombers. Period. Every West Point textbook, every operational manual, every training directive hammered home the same principle. Fighters flew in tight defensive formations around the bomber streams, never breaking away, never pursuing enemy aircraft beyond visual range of their charges. When German fighters attacked, American P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and the newer P-51 Mustangs would engage just long enough to drive them off, then return to the bomber's side like faithful shepherds. This strategy was failing spectacularly. According to historical documentation from the United States Air Force Historical Research Agency, the Luftwaffe had adapted brilliantly to this predictable defensive posture. German fighter commanders, led by veterans like Adolf Galland, simply waited beyond the escort's engagement range, then swarmed the bombers when the American fighters inevitably returned to formation. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 pilots had developed tactics specifically designed to exploit this weakness. They'd feint, withdraw, then attack from unexpected angles the moment the escorts pulled back. Doolittle studied the loss reports with mounting fury. He'd flown fighters himself in the Great War. He understood something that the desk-bound strategists at headquarters apparently didn't. Fighter pilots were hunters, not babysitters. You couldn't cage an eagle and expect it to be effective. The very nature of fighter combat demanded aggression, initiative, and the freedom to pursue the enemy until he was destroyed. But suggesting a change would be heresy. It would be career suicide. It would mean contradicting every senior officer in the European theater of operations and potentially condemning more bomber crews to death if he was wrong. His subordinates already thought he was reckless. Some whispered he was mad. Doolittle didn't care. He'd never much cared for safe thinking. February the 15th, 1944. The conference room at Bushy Park fell silent when Doolittle announced his intention. 20 senior officers sat around the heavy oak table, their faces registering shock, then disbelief, then something approaching horror. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, later recalled that the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. What Doolittle proposed wasn't merely unorthodox. It was revolutionary, possibly suicidal, and definitely against standing orders from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Gentlemen, effective immediately, all fighter escorts are to pursue and destroy enemy aircraft wherever they find them, Doolittle stated flatly, his voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone he might use to order coffee. You will no longer remain tied to the bomber formations. If you spot German fighters on the ground, strafe them. If they're taking off, shoot them down. If they retreat to their bases, follow them home and destroy their airfields. The mission of the 8th Air Force Fighter Arm is no longer bomber protection. It's the destruction of the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. The objections erupted like flak bursts. This violated every principle of escort duty. What about the bombers? Who would protect them when German fighters inevitably broke through? The losses would be catastrophic. General Henry Hap Arnold back in Washington would never approve. General Dwight Eisenhower would have Doolittle court-martialed. This was madness wrapped in suicide, wrapped in career-ending disaster. Brigadier General William Kepner, commanding the 8th Fighter Command, pounded the table. "Jimmy, they'll crucify you for this. The bomber barons will demand your head on a platter. You're asking fighter pilots to abandon their primary mission." Doolittle's response was characteristic, direct, logical, and utterly unbending. "The primary mission hasn't changed. It's still getting bombers to their targets and home again. But we're not accomplishing that mission by playing defense. The Luftwaffe has 400 fighters we know about, probably twice that many we don't. Every day we dance around the bombers. Those fighters live to fight another day. We need to kill them, all of them, on the ground, in the air, wherever they hide. Dead pilots don't shoot down our bombers." He produced reconnaissance photographs showing German airfields across occupied France, Belgium, and Germany itself. Rows of fighters sat exposed on concrete aprons, lined up like carnival targets. Intelligence estimated the Luftwaffe kept nearly 60% of their fighter force on the ground at any given time, rotating squadrons to maintain combat readiness. Those aircraft represented hundreds of potential bomber kills, unless someone destroyed them first. The strategy carried enormous risk. If Doolittle was wrong, if the bomber losses spiked even higher without the close escort protection, the entire American strategic bombing campaign might collapse. The planned invasion of Europe, already scheduled for some time in mid-1944, depended absolutely on Allied air superiority. If the Luftwaffe maintained its strength, if German fighters could still contest the skies over Normandy or wherever the invasion came, thousands of troops would die on the beaches. But Doolittle had done his mathematics. Current tactics were killing 300 American airmen per week. The 8th Air Force was consuming replacement crews faster than training commands could produce them. Several bomber groups were already below operational strength. Within 6 months, maybe less, the strategic bombing campaign would simply run out of men willing to climb into those coffins with wings. Something had to change, and it had to change immediately. Doolittle pulled rank and ended the debate. "This is not a discussion, gentlemen. It's an order. Brief your squadrons. The next mission into Germany, our fighters will have free rein to engage any enemy aircraft they encounter. The Luftwaffe has been fighting on their terms for too long. Starting now, we're taking the fight to them." He dismissed the meeting, knowing full well he'd just bet his career, his reputation, and potentially thousands of lives on a strategy that contradicted everything the Army Air Forces had taught for a decade. But Jimmy Doolittle hadn't become a legend by playing it safe. February the 20th, 1944. The weather over Europe had been execrable for weeks. Thick cloud cover, ice storms, and visibility measured in yards rather than miles. Strategic bombing required clear skies for accurate targeting, so the massive fleets of fortresses and liberators had sat grounded, their crews restless and increasingly fatalistic. But meteorologists at Supreme Headquarters were predicting a break in the weather pattern, a window of perhaps 5 to 7 days when the skies over Germany would clear enough for sustained operations. General Carl Toohey Spaatz, commanding United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, authorized what would become known as Operation Argument, though the bomber crews and fighter pilots would remember it by another name: Big Week. The plan was brutally simple: launch maximum effort raids against German aircraft production facilities, forcing the Luftwaffe to commit every available fighter to defend them, then destroy those fighters in the air and on the ground. It was an all-or-nothing gamble that would either cripple German air power or result in losses so catastrophic that the daylight bombing campaign might never recover. Doolittle's controversial new fighter tactics would receive their first real test. At 0400 hours on February the 20th, air raid sirens wailed across dozens of English airfields. Bomber crews stumbled from their Nissen huts into the pre-dawn cold, breath steaming, pulling on heavy fleece-lined jackets and throat microphones. They attended briefings where intelligence officers pulled back curtains to reveal maps showing deep penetration raids into central Germany: Leipzig, Brunswick, Tudow, Rostock. The groans were audible. These were heavily defended targets, requiring 6 to 7 hours of flying time through the most concentrated anti-aircraft defenses in Europe. But something was different this morning. Fighter pilots were grinning. Major Don Blakesley, commanding the 4th Fighter Group at Debden, addressed his Mustang pilots with barely contained enthusiasm. "Gentlemen, the leash is off. You find a German fighter, you kill him. You see a German airfield, you strafe it, you run low on ammunition, you go home and rearm, then you get back out there. Today we're not babysitters, we're hunters." The response was electric. Fighter pilots had been chomping at the bit for months, forced to watch German fighters retreat just beyond engagement range while they circled uselessly above the bombers. Now they were being turned loose to do what they'd trained for: aggressive, offensive combat. At 0800 hours, the first bomber streams began forming up over England. Over 1,000 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force, plus additional forces from the 15th Air Force operating from Italy, would strike that day. Escorting them would be 17 fighter groups, hundreds of Thunderbolts, Lightnings, and Mustangs operating under Doolittle's new doctrine. The formations crossed the channel and penetrated German airspace. Luftwaffe controllers tracked them on radar, scrambling fighters from bases across the Reich. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf squadrons climbed to intercept, expecting the usual engagement pattern: dive through the escorts, hit the bombers, break away before the American fighters could effectively respond. What happened instead shocked the German pilots. American fighters didn't just engage defensively, they pursued with savage aggression. When Messerschmitts dove away from bomber formations, Mustangs followed them all the way to the deck, continuing combat until the German aircraft were destroyed, or the Americans ran critically low on fuel. Thunderbolts spotted fighters forming up on the ground at forward airfields and immediately peeled off to strafe them, destroying aircraft before they could even take off. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group described the chaos in his combat report. "We were free to hunt, and we hunted like wolves. Every German fighter we saw became a target. We chased them to their airfields, caught them landing with wheels down, shot them on their takeoff runs." For the first time, the Luftwaffe was fighting on our terms. The bomber losses that day were significant. 21 aircraft failed to return, but the Luftwaffe paid an extraordinary price. According to post-war records compiled by German aviation historian Werner Gerbig, the Luftwaffe lost over 60 fighters on February the 20th alone, with dozens more damaged beyond repair. More critically, experienced pilots were being killed at rates the German training system couldn't replace. This was exactly what Doolittle had intended: an exchange rate that favored American production capacity and pilot training over German resources. Big Week had begun, and the mathematics of aerial combat were about to shift dramatically. February the 21st through 23rd, 1944. The weather held, and Doolittle pressed his advantage with the ruthless efficiency of a man who understood that hesitation meant death. Every day brought massive raids: 500, 600, sometimes over 1,000 bombers hammering German industrial targets, while fighter escorts roamed freely across the Reich, hunting for victims. The Luftwaffe was being bled white. German fighter commanders found themselves in an impossible strategic bind. If they didn't contest the bomber raids, American heavies would systematically destroy the factories producing the fighters Germany needed to defend itself. A death spiral that ended in complete industrial collapse. But if they did scramble to intercept, they faced American fighters that were no longer constrained by defensive doctrine, that pursued with relentless aggression, and that increasingly controlled the tactical initiative. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, a Luftwaffe ace flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, wrote in his diary of the changing character of aerial combat: "The Americans have become wolves. Before, they were sheepdogs, predictable and cautious. Now they attack with fury, following us to our very airfields. We take off and they are waiting. We land and they strafe us on the ground. There is no safety anymore, nowhere to rest." The psychological impact proved as devastating as the material losses. German fighter pilots had been conditioned to expect American escorts to break off pursuit after a certain distance or time. That assumption had provided a crucial safety valve. If combat went badly, you could dive away, run for home, and live to fight another day. Doolittle's doctrine eliminated that option. American fighters pursued until they achieved kills or exhausted their ammunition and fuel. For Luftwaffe pilots, every engagement became potentially fatal. The strafing attacks on German airfields produced spectacular results. Colonel Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group caught a major Luftwaffe base at Gilseriehen in Holland during a squadron rotation. Dozens of fighters sat on the ground, being serviced and refueled. Zemke's Thunderbolts came in at treetop level, cannons blazing, and transformed the airfield into an inferno. Eyewitness accounts described fuel bowsers exploding, aircraft burning, and ground crews diving for cover as 50 caliber incendiary rounds tore through thin-skinned fighters like paper. One attack destroyed more aircraft in 5 minutes than an entire day of bomber raids might have accomplished. The numbers told a brutal story. On February the 21st, the Luftwaffe lost 53 fighters. February the 22nd cost them 64 more. February the 23rd added another 48 destroyed. The accounting didn't include damaged aircraft that would require weeks of repairs, or the mounting toll of experienced pilots. Men like Lieutenant Fritz Oblisser, a 21-kill ace shot down and killed by a Mustang pilot who pursued him to ground level over Bavaria. German aircraft production couldn't keep pace with the losses. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, frantically accelerated fighter production, dispersing factories to avoid concentrated bombing. But replacing aircraft was only part of the problem. Replacing pilots was becoming impossible. Training a competent fighter pilot required 6 to 9 months under peacetime conditions. By early 1944, Germany's training infrastructure was crumbling. Fuel shortages limited flight hours for trainees. Experienced instructors were being pulled from training duties to fly combat missions because frontline units were desperately short of personnel. New pilots arrived at operational squadrons with minimal flight time, no combat experience, and life expectancies measured in days. Major General Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, confronted Hermann Göring with increasingly desperate assessments. The Reichsmarschall refused to accept reality, blaming Galland's pilots for cowardice and lack of fighting spirit. Galland knew better. His pilots were dying heroically and pointlessly, throwing themselves against an enemy that now possessed overwhelming numerical and tactical advantages. The strategic implications were becoming clear. If the Luftwaffe couldn't control German airspace, the planned Allied invasion would proceed under friendly skies. German armor and infantry would be subjected to devastating air attacks with minimal protection. The Wehrmacht's vaunted mobile defense doctrine depended on rapid redeployment of forces, impossible if Allied fighter bombers controlled the skies. Doolittle's mad strategy was working, and the window of opportunity was closing for Germany. Every day of Big Week brought the Reich closer to losing the air war entirely. The general they'd called reckless was proving to be devastatingly right. February the 24th, 1944. The sprawling Messerschmitt factory complex at Gotha represented one of the Third Reich's most critical industrial assets, producing Bf-110 night fighters at a rate of 70 aircraft per month. Intelligence analysts at 8th Air Force Headquarters had been studying this target for weeks, building a detailed understanding of its production capacity, defensive arrangements, and strategic importance. The factory had to be destroyed, but it lay deep inside Germany, nearly 400 miles from England, requiring bombers to run a gauntlet of flak batteries and fighter bases. Major General Doolittle ordered a maximum effort strike. 238 B-17 flying fortresses escorted by every available fighter. The raid would test his controversial doctrine under the worst possible conditions, extended penetration into heavily defended airspace with predictable routes and clear objectives. The Luftwaffe would know exactly where the bombers were heading and would have time to position overwhelming fighter strength for interception. The bomber crews climbed into their aircraft knowing this would be among the most dangerous missions of the war. Captain Robert Hughes, pilot of a fortress named Shady Lady, later recalled the pervading sense of fatalism at the morning briefing. When they showed us Gotha on the map, half the room went silent. That far into Germany, we'd be fighting most of the way there and back, but the fighters had been doing good work, and we figured maybe, just maybe, they'd keep enough Germans off our backs that we'd have a chance. The formations assembled over England in clear skies, a rarity during the winter of 1943 to 1944. At 1000 hours, they crossed the Dutch coast and immediately encountered German fighters. But something had changed in the Luftwaffe's response pattern. Instead of massed formations attacking aggressively, German pilots seemed hesitant, making cautious approaches and breaking off when American escorts engaged. This wasn't cowardice. It was exhaustion and depleted numbers. Big Week had already cost the Luftwaffe over 250 fighters in just 4 days. Replacement pilots were arriving at squadrons with minimal training, sometimes less than 20 hours in type. Squadron commanders were issuing desperate orders: avoid prolonged combat with escorts, target the bombers exclusively, break away if pursued. The aggressive interceptor tactics that had dominated 1943 were becoming untenable. Colonel James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group was escorting bombers near Brunswick when he spotted his squadron being drawn away by a German feint. A large formation of Messerschmitts was approaching the bomber stream from another direction, and the fortresses were suddenly vulnerable. In one of the war's most remarkable individual actions, Howard, flying alone, attacked the entire German formation. For over 30 minutes, Howard engaged approximately 30 enemy fighters single-handedly, executing what military historians would later call one of the most audacious displays of fighter combat in aviation history. He destroyed at least 4 German aircraft, post-war analysis suggested the number might have been 6, and disrupted the entire enemy formation, preventing them from making coordinated attacks on the bombers. His Mustang absorbed multiple hits but remained airborne, and his actions bought time for other American fighters to return and relieve the pressure. President Franklin Roosevelt would later award Howard the Medal of Honor, but that recognition came weeks later. On February the 24th, he was simply doing what Doolittle's new doctrine encouraged: aggressive, independent action to destroy enemy aircraft, regardless of numerical odds. The Gotha raid successfully struck its targets, with fortresses dropping over 500 tons of high explosives on the Messerschmitt factory complex. Reconnaissance photos showed extensive damage to assembly halls, machine shops, and warehouses. Post-raid analysis estimated production would be disrupted for at least 6 weeks, critical months as the Allies prepared for invasion. But the cost remained significant. The 8th Air Force lost 49 bombers and their crews that day. Each bomber carried 10 men: pilots, co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, flight engineers, radio operators, and gunners. 490 men failed to return. Some were killed instantly by flak or fighter attacks, blown apart at high altitude. Others parachuted into captivity, spending the war's remainder in stalags and prisoner camps. A few evaded capture and made harrowing journeys through occupied Europe to safety. Yet even these losses represented a victory of sorts. Under the old doctrine, raids this deep into Germany routinely lost 70, 80, even 100 bombers. Doolittle's fighters were making the impossible merely difficult. The mathematics of attrition were slowly, bloodily, shifting in favor of the Allies, and the Luftwaffe was running out of experienced pilots to stem the tide. February the 25th, 1944. At Luftwaffe bases scattered across Germany and occupied territories, the morning ritual had acquired a nightmarish quality. Pilots who'd survived the previous day's combat stumbled to briefing rooms, red-eyed and exhausted, to learn they'd be flying again. And again. And again. The 8th Air Force wasn't giving them time to rest, repair damaged aircraft, or absorb replacement pilots. The American strategy had evolved beyond mere tactical aggression. It had become a calculated campaign to break the Luftwaffe's operational capacity through sheer, relentless pressure. Lieutenant Heinz Marquardt of Jagdgeschwader 3 wrote home in what would be his final letter: "We fly until we die. There is no other outcome now. The Americans come every day, and every day there are fewer of us to meet them. Young pilots arrive from training schools, boys who barely know how to land properly, and they're dead within the week. The experienced men are so tired we make mistakes. Yesterday I nearly collided with my wingman during takeoff because I was watching the sky for enemy fighters instead of focusing on flying. This cannot continue, but it will continue until none of us remain." The letter reached his family 3 days after Marquardt's Messerschmitt was shot down near Schweinfurt by a Thunderbolt pilot from the 56th Fighter Group. Big Week's 6th day brought another massive raid. Over 700 heavy bombers targeting aircraft factories at Regensburg, Stuttgart, and Augsburg, escorted by 14 fighter groups operating in relays. The escort tactics had been refined during the previous days of combat. Fighters no longer stayed with the bombers throughout the entire mission. Instead, they aggressively swept ahead of the formations, clearing German interceptors from the bombers' path, then returning to cover the vulnerable heavy aircraft during their bombing runs. This fighter sweep concept was revolutionary. Traditional doctrine held that dispersing escorts weakened defensive coverage, but Doolittle's approach recognized that the best defense was preventing attacks from occurring in the first place. By destroying German fighters before they could form up for coordinated bomber attacks, American escorts reduced losses far more effectively than they ever had through close defensive flying. Hauptmann Horst Carganico, a decorated experte with 41 confirmed victories, scrambled with his staffel from Leifheim Airfield at 1100 hours. His flight of 8 Focke-Wulf FW-190s climbed through scattered clouds, hunting for the bomber stream intelligence had reported heading toward Stuttgart. Instead, they encountered 4 flights of P-51 Mustangs hunting them. The engagement lasted less than 3 minutes. Carganico's squadron was shattered. 5 aircraft were shot down, including Carganico's, who bailed out with serious burns. 2 more Focke-Wulfs limped home with severe damage. Only 1 pilot emerged completely unscathed. The Mustang squadron reported no losses. These were the exchanges that were killing the Luftwaffe. Not just the aircraft losses, which German industry could theoretically replace, but the steady hemorrhaging of experienced combat leaders. Carganico had been training new pilots, sharing hard-won tactical knowledge, and providing the kind of combat leadership that couldn't be manufactured in factories or taught in classrooms. His loss represented an irreplaceable gap in his unit's combat effectiveness. Similar scenes were playing out across the Reich. At Jagdgeschwader 2, the squadron's top ace was killed when thunderbolts caught him taking off from Cambrai-Epinoy. At Jagdgeschwader 51, an entire staffel was decimated by a diving attack from lightnings that came out of the sun with perfect surprise. At Jagdgeschwader 26, the unit's operations officer died when his cockpit was hit by 50 caliber rounds during a low-altitude pursuit. Albert Speer met with Adolf Hitler that evening, presenting the accumulated damage assessments from Big Week. According to post-war documentation from Speer's memoirs, the Führer initially dismissed the reports as defeatist exaggeration. When Speer insisted the statistics were accurate, Hitler flew into a rage, blaming Göring, blaming the fighter pilots, blaming saboteurs and defeatists, blaming everyone except himself and the strategic decisions that had led Germany to this point. The reality remained unchanged by Hitler's fury. German fighter production facilities had suffered catastrophic damage. More critically, the pilot attrition rate had exceeded 30% during Big Week, unsustainable by any military standard. The Luftwaffe was being systematically destroyed, not through a single decisive battle, but through sustained, coordinated pressure that prevented recovery or reconstitution of combat power. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland attempted one final organizational reform, pulling experienced pilots from across the Reich to form elite interceptor units concentrated around critical targets. The theory was sound: concentrate strength at decisive points rather than dispersing forces across the entire front. But it was too late, and there weren't enough experienced pilots remaining to make the strategy viable. The window for stopping the Allied invasion was closing. The Luftwaffe needed time to rebuild, time to train pilots, time to disperse production and repair accumulated damage. Time it wouldn't be given. February the 26th, 1944. Big Week concluded as the weather over Europe finally began to deteriorate, bringing the sustained operations to a natural close. In 6 days of intensive combat, the United States 8th and 15th Air Forces had flown approximately 3,800 heavy bomber sorties, dropping nearly 10,000 tons of high explosives on German aircraft production facilities. Fighter escorts had flown thousands of additional sorties, engaging in aerial combat across the breadth of the Reich. The accounting was brutal on both sides. The American losses were severe: 226 heavy bombers destroyed, representing over 2,000 airmen killed or captured. An additional 28 fighters were lost, their pilots dead or imprisoned. Each loss represented families receiving War Department telegrams, mothers and wives learning their sons and husbands weren't coming home. The human cost of Doolittle's strategy was measured in hundreds of fresh graves and thousands of shattered lives. But the Luftwaffe had suffered catastrophically worse. German records, meticulously compiled during the war and analyzed afterward, revealed losses that exceeded even optimistic American estimates. Over 500 fighters were destroyed during Big Week, shot down in combat, destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks, or damaged beyond economical repair. More significantly, nearly 300 pilots were killed, wounded, or captured. For a force already stretched desperately thin, these losses were unsustainable. The qualitative damage was even more devastating than the numerical losses. Germany had lost squadron commanders, flight leaders, and experienced combat veterans whose tactical knowledge couldn't be replaced. Training infrastructure had been disrupted by the bombing campaign, making it nearly impossible to produce replacement pilots at the rate needed. New pilots arriving at operational units had sometimes logged fewer than 50 flight hours total, barely enough to keep an aircraft in the air, let alone engage in combat against battle-hardened American pilots flying superior aircraft. Major General Galland submitted yet another desperate report to Göring, analyzing the strategic situation with clinical precision. According to post-war documentation, Galland's assessment concluded the Luftwaffe had effectively lost air superiority over the Reich. German fighters could still contest control of the skies, could still inflict casualties on bombing raids, but they could no longer prevent American bombers from reaching any target the Allies deemed important. The implications for the coming invasion were stark. German ground forces would face Allied armies supported by overwhelming air power. Göring reportedly responded by accusing Galland of defeatism and considering his removal from command. Reality, however, wasn't swayed by the Reichsmarschall's delusions. The Luftwaffe was broken, and everyone except the Nazi leadership seemed to understand this fact. Doolittle's controversial strategy had achieved in 6 days what years of conventional bomber operations had failed to accomplish: genuine, measurable destruction of German air combat power. The mad general's tactics had proven devastatingly effective, validating aggressive fighter employment and fundamentally changing how air superiority campaigns would be conducted for the remainder of the war and beyond. The strategic impact extended far beyond February 1944. German aircraft production did recover to some extent. Speer's dispersal efforts and industrial reorganization actually increased fighter production numbers later in 1944. But production without pilots was meaningless. The Luftwaffe never recovered the experienced cadre lost during Big Week. New pilots continued arriving at squadrons throughout 1944 and 1945, but they died with such regularity that units became little more than training grounds feeding fresh casualties into an unwinnable war of attrition. When Allied forces stormed ashore at Normandy on June 6, 1944, a date history would remember as D-Day, Luftwaffe resistance was minimal. German pilots made sporadic attacks on the invasion fleet and beaches, but they were too few, too poorly trained, and too overwhelmed by Allied air superiority to significantly influence the battle. In the invasion's first 24 hours, Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe managed barely 300. The contrast with previous amphibious operations was remarkable. At Sicily in July 1943, German and Italian air forces had contested Allied landings with significant effect, sinking ships and inflicting casualties despite ultimately being unable to prevent the invasion. At Salerno that September, Luftwaffe attacks had been fierce enough to threaten the beachhead's viability. But at Normandy, Allied troops looked up to see friendly aircraft dominating the skies, a direct result of Big Week's systematic destruction of German air combat power. Historians and military analysts would spend decades studying Big Week, analyzing its tactics and strategic implications. The campaign became a case study at military academies worldwide, illustrating principles of offensive air operations, the importance of aggressive fighter employment, and the cumulative effect of sustained pressure on an enemy's recuperative capacity. March 3, 1944. Just days after Big Week concluded, General Doolittle sat in the same Bushy Park office where he'd announced his controversial tactical changes. The morning report spread across his desk told a story that would have seemed fantastical weeks earlier. Bomber losses on recent missions were averaging below 3%. Some raids were returning with losses under 1%. The nightmare mathematics that had defined the 8th Air Force's existence for months were fundamentally, dramatically changing. The transformation wasn't merely tactical, it was psychological. Bomber crews no longer approached missions with the fatalistic certainty they were flying toward death. Fighter pilots operated with aggressive confidence, knowing they had the freedom to hunt and destroy enemy aircraft rather than passively defending bombers. The entire organizational culture of the 8th Air Force had shifted from defensive desperation to offensive dominance. Colonel Donald Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group submitted a combat report that captured the new reality. The Luftwaffe is no longer a significant threat to our operations. They rise to challenge us, but in small numbers and with obvious reluctance. Their new pilots are poorly trained and easily defeated. The experienced German pilots we encounter fight skillfully, but without the aggressive confidence they displayed months ago. They know they're losing. We can feel it every time we engage them. Military historians later documented that the Luftwaffe's effectiveness continued declining throughout spring and summer 1944. German industry produced record numbers of fighters, over 3,000 in July 1944 alone, but aircraft without trained pilots were merely expensive scrap metal. Training programs couldn't produce competent pilots fast enough to replace losses. New pilots arrived at squadrons, flew a handful of missions, and died. The Luftwaffe had entered a death spiral from which recovery proved impossible. Doolittle's vindication came gradually, then overwhelmingly. The same senior officers who'd opposed his tactics in February were praising his genius by April. General Eisenhower cited the 8th Air Force's air superiority campaign as critical to invasion planning. General Arnold sent congratulatory messages from Washington. Even the bomber commanders, initially skeptical that reducing close escort protection wouldn't result in catastrophic losses, acknowledged the strategy's success. But Doolittle himself never claimed credit for revolutionary brilliance. In post-war interviews and his autobiography, he described the tactical changes as common sense applied to an obvious problem. Fighter pilots were trained hunters. Use them to hunt. The Luftwaffe was a finite resource. Destroy it systematically. The complicated mathematical calculations and strategic assessments boiled down to simple principles that should have been obvious to anyone who understood aerial combat. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps the tactical solutions were obvious in retrospect. But implementing those solutions required moral courage that transcended tactical cleverness. Doolittle had been willing to stake his reputation, his career, and potentially thousands of lives on a doctrine that contradicted established practice. If Big Week had failed, if bomber losses had spiked catastrophically, history would have remembered him not as a visionary, but as a reckless commander who sacrificed men for a failed experiment. The gamble paid off because Doolittle understood something fundamental about warfare. Audacity and aggression, applied intelligently against the right targets at the right moment, could achieve results that caution and conventional thinking never would. He'd proven this in the Tokyo raid, and he proved it again over the skies of occupied Europe. The broader strategic implications extended beyond World War II. Air forces worldwide studied Big Week's lessons and incorporated them into doctrine. The principle of offensive fighter operations, of seeking and destroying enemy air power, rather than merely defending friendly forces, became foundational to modern air superiority campaigns. From Korea to Vietnam to the Gulf War and beyond, military planners applied variations of Doolittle's aggressive fighter employment doctrine. The personal cost remained. Those 226 bombers lost during Big Week represented over 2,000 families forever changed. Fighter pilots who survived carried memories of friends who didn't. German pilots and their families suffered equivalently, young men dying in burning aircraft thousands of feet above their homeland. War's brutality doesn't diminish because one side fights more effectively than another. Doolittle was promoted to lieutenant general in March 1944 and later to full general, retiring from the Air Force in 1946. He lived until January the 15th, 92. Doolittle was promoted to lieutenant general in March 1944 and later to full general, retiring from the Air Force in 1946. He lived until January the 15th, 1993, reaching the age of 96, long enough to see the doctrine he'd implemented become standard practice across the world's air forces. In his final years, he rarely spoke about Big Week except to emphasize the courage of the men who'd flown the missions, the crews who'd died in burning aircraft, and the strategic necessity of what had been accomplished. The official Air Force history, compiled decades after the war's end, characterized Big Week as the decisive turning point in the air war over Europe. The assessment wasn't hyperbolic. Before Big Week, German air power represented a genuine threat to Allied strategic objectives. After Big Week, the Luftwaffe existed primarily as a wasting asset, still dangerous in specific circumstances, but fundamentally unable to contest Allied air superiority or influence the war's outcome. The human dimension of this transformation remained complex and morally ambiguous. American crews celebrated their survival and growing dominance, but they understood their victories were purchased with German lives. Young men not fundamentally different from themselves, caught in a war they hadn't chosen, dying because political leaders had made catastrophic decisions. Many Allied pilots later expressed complicated feelings about their wartime experiences. Pride in their service mixed with sorrow for the destruction they'd inflicted. German pilot survivors of Big Week carried different burdens. Men like Heinz Nock, who survived the war, wrote memoirs describing the psychological trauma of fighting a losing battle against overwhelming odds, watching comrades die daily, knowing their efforts were ultimately futile. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots had been among Nazi Germany's elite, young men selected for their skill and courage, trained extensively, and thrown into combat against enemies with superior numbers, resources, and by 1944 superior tactical doctrine. Their defeat wasn't inevitable from the war's beginning. German fighter pilots had dominated European skies during 1940 through early 1943, achieving victory ratios that shocked Allied commanders. But strategic overreach, industrial limitations, and ultimately tactical rigidity created vulnerabilities that commanders like Doolittle were positioned to exploit. Big Week represented the culmination of those exploitations, the moment when accumulated German weaknesses intersected with Allied strengths under leadership willing to embrace radical tactical change. The broader historical narrative places Big Week within the larger context of Allied victory in Europe. The systematic destruction of German air power enabled D-Day's success, which established the second front Stalin had demanded, which forced Germany to fight a truly two-front war, which led to Berlin's capture and Nazi Germany's complete defeat. Each step was necessary. Big Week wasn't sufficient by itself to win the war, but it was necessary for subsequent operations to succeed. In that sense, Doolittle's controversial decisions in February 1944 rippled forward through history, influencing events far beyond the immediate tactical victories. The bomber crews who survived Big Week went on to fly missions supporting the Normandy invasion, destroying German infrastructure, and systematically dismantling the Third Reich's ability to wage war. Fighter pilots who gained experience during Big Week's intense combat became the cadre who trained subsequent generations of American aviators, passing forward the aggressive tactical doctrine that had proven so effective. The legacy endured in unexpected ways. When the United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, its foundational doctrine emphasized offensive air operations and the importance of air superiority as a prerequisite for all other military operations. This thinking descended directly from Big Week's lessons. Modern air campaigns, from Desert Storm in 1991 to operations over Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq, all began with fighter sweeps designed to destroy enemy air forces and establish air superiority before commencing other operations. Doolittle's reckless strategy had become orthodoxy. The officers who'd initially opposed Doolittle's tactics, men who genuinely believed close escort protection was the only viable doctrine, eventually acknowledged their error. Some, like Brigadier General Kepner, became advocates for offensive fighter operations and helped institutionalize the lessons learned. Others quietly accepted that conventional wisdom had been wrong and adapted accordingly. The willingness to learn from combat experience, even when it contradicted established doctrine, became itself a valuable organizational lesson. The statistical record proved unambiguous. From January through early February 1944, before Doolittle implemented his tactical changes, 8th Air Force bomber losses averaged 6 to 7% per mission on deep penetration raids. After Big Week, for the remainder of 1944, losses averaged below 2% across all mission types. The reduction represented thousands of airmen who survived the war because aggressive fighter tactics had broken the Luftwaffe's back. But history remembers individuals, not just statistics. Captain Robert Hughes, the B-17 pilot who'd survived the Gotha raid, flew 35 missions and returned home to Ohio in September 1944. He never forgot the Mustangs that had saved his formation multiple times, fighting with such aggression that German interceptors couldn't press home their attacks. Hughes named his first son James, after the general whose tactics had kept him alive. Lieutenant Colonel John Meyer, who described his squadron hunting like wolves during Big Week, survived the war with 24 confirmed aerial victories. He remained in the Air Force after 1945, eventually reaching 4-star rank and commanding the Strategic Air Command during the Cold War. Meyer frequently credited Doolittle's tactical flexibility and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom as formative influences on his own command philosophy. Major Don Blakesley flew combat throughout 1944, leading the 4th Fighter Group to legendary status with over 1,000 confirmed aerial victories. He retired as a full colonel, having never been shot down despite flying over 500 combat missions. In retirement, Blakesley gave occasional interviews where he characterized Big Week as the moment we stopped fighting, scared, and started fighting to win. The German survivors carried different memories. Those who lived through Big Week and survived the war's remainder found themselves on history's losing side, their courage and skill ultimately insufficient against Allied material superiority and tactical evolution. Many, like Heinz Knoke, struggled with reconciling their service to a criminal regime with their personal honor as combat pilots. These contradictions, fighting bravely in an unjust cause, remained unresolved for many German veterans throughout their post-war lives. Adolf Galland was dismissed from his position as General der Jagdflieger in January 1945 after repeatedly clashing with Göring over the Luftwaffe's deteriorating situation. He formed an elite jet fighter unit that flew Me-262 jets in combat during the war's final months, achieving remarkable success despite overwhelming odds. Galland survived the war and later wrote extensively about the Luftwaffe's defeat, analyzing how tactical and strategic failures had doomed German air power despite individual gallantry. In his post-war writings, Galland specifically cited Big Week as the decisive turning point, the moment when the Luftwaffe lost not just a battle, but the capacity to recover from defeat. The systematic destruction of experienced pilots, combined with attacks on training infrastructure and production facilities, created a downward spiral from which recovery proved impossible. Galland's analysis aligned remarkably closely with what Doolittle had intended, not merely winning individual engagements, but destroying the enemy's ability to continue fighting. This strategic vision, seeing beyond immediate tactical victories to campaign-level objectives, distinguished great commanders from merely competent ones. Doolittle understood that killing German fighters in February 1944 mattered not for February's sake, but because it prevented those fighters from opposing the invasion in June. Every Messerschmitt destroyed on the ground was one that wouldn't strafe Allied troops on Normandy's beaches. Every experienced German pilot killed in combat was one who wouldn't train the next generation of interceptor pilots. The mathematics were brutal, but undeniable. War, particularly industrial-scale warfare conducted by modern nation-states, ultimately became an accounting exercise, measuring loss ratios, production rates, training pipeline capacities, and logistical sustainability. Doolittle's genius lay in understanding these calculations intuitively and implementing tactics that maximized American advantages while exploiting German vulnerabilities. By March 1944, those calculations had shifted decisively. The Luftwaffe still flew, still fought, and still occasionally achieved local successes, but the strategic balance had fundamentally changed. Germany couldn't replace losses faster than they accumulated. Training couldn't produce pilots fast enough. Industry couldn't manufacture sufficient aircraft. The Reich was losing, and every month the margin of defeat widened. Big Week didn't end the war. Another 14 months of savage combat remained before Germany's surrender. But it established conditions that made Allied victory inevitable rather than merely probable. The invasion could proceed. Bomber operations could continue with acceptable losses. Allied air forces could support ground operations with overwhelming strength. These capabilities, purchased with blood over occupied Europe during 6 days in February, proved decisive when the invasion finally came. General Jimmy Doolittle, the mad general whose reckless tactics had been questioned, doubted, and opposed, had proven fundamentally, decisively correct. His willingness to challenge orthodoxy, to trust his instincts against institutional resistance, and to accept the moral burden of command decisions had altered the war's trajectory. Not through genius that transcended human understanding, but through practical application of sound tactical principles supported by moral courage. That combination, tactical intelligence combined with audacity, remains rare in any era. It's the difference between commanders who follow established procedures and those who change how wars are fought. History vindicated Doolittle completely. The fighter tactics implemented during Big Week became doctrine. The aggressive pursuit of enemy air power became standard practice. The principle that controlling the air required destroying enemy forces rather than merely defending friendly ones became foundational to modern air warfare, and thousands of Allied servicemen came home who might otherwise have died. A legacy measured not in tonnage dropped or aircraft destroyed, but in lives saved and futures possible. That, ultimately, was the measure of Doolittle's success. Not the tactical brilliance or strategic vision, but the human outcome of decisions made under pressure when the stakes couldn't have been higher. The general they called mad had saved countless lives by being willing to risk everything on a doctrine he believed was right. History would remember him not for caution, but for audacity, not for following rules, but for rewriting them when necessity demanded. And the Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, never recovered from those 6 days in February 1944, when American fighters were finally unleashed to hunt.